I almost called it a Switch. Nintendo would have sued us. Today we're putting the Valve Steam Deck through the most intensive hardware benchmarking suite we can cram into a single video. This hardware review of the Steam Deck will include exhaustive thermals with thermocouples mounted everywhere, Schlieren photography to show the air density change, controlled acoustic testing, battery life testing, power consumption, and a lot more. Now we're not allowed to talk about the software today because Valve's not ready yet and won't be for another 2 weeks or so, but we are allowed to talk about everything related to the hardware. And that's why our goal for this video was to make the definitive look at the Steam Deck's hardware, internal design, and anything related to the components. This extremely in-depth testing is brought to you by us and the GN store over at store.gamersnexus.net. Our GN coaster packs are almost back, and they're on back order now for the first time in months. When we launched these, we blew through the stock of these highly unique, fully custom electronics-themed drink 4-pack coasters in about just 36 hours. Now they're finally almost back, and they have a ship date on the store page. The drink coasters use vibrant colors on a high-quality rubberized material to act as a spill guard to protect your tables, while also decorating them with a collectible item. We designed them with custom-molded 3D computer components carefully positioned to support drinks, 8mm thick borders for high durability and longevity, and made them easily washable under running water. The coasters include a PC case fan with carefully banked blades to support drinks, a GN logo with multiple layers of SMDs, caps, inductors, and VRM parts, a CPU socket and motherboard with gold pins, and a GPU PCB with VRM modules. We spent weeks on this content, so to support our independent testing and get something awesome in return, back order now at store.gamersnexus.net to guarantee you'll get one in the next round. This video was a huge undertaking, and it was really difficult to try and cram it all down into as short of a video as we could. So it's a bit of a lengthier feature piece. We have several follow-ups, including a separate teardown coming up basically immediately. We'll be doing a subjective look at the controls, how the device feels and handles as well. That won't be in this one. It's not part of today's focus. We'll also be talking about pressure mapping, frequency behavior, all of that stuff. That will be a series of videos coming up, so make sure you subscribe to catch all of those as we post them. Couple quick disclaimers. Valve was coming in hot with this thing. They were pushing daily updates, which is kind of cool to see. It's also a challenge to keep up with. All of our data was collected in the last 2 days before publishing this video, so we have about the freshest possible data you can have on this. But even still, it's probably going to change a little bit more up until launch. The core functionality of this will not be changing, but the software absolutely will be changing, especially the UI, which we can't show anyway. This is technically a pre-production unit, but it represents the production units. We also have a production unit coming in. We'll be able to do a follow-up on that in case anything changes. Anyway, there's way too much to talk about in this video, so let's just immediately start with the data. Okay, so we've done Schlieren imaging a few times now. We've done it with the RTX 3080 to look at the really specific Founders Edition flow pattern. We also did it with the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox, whatever it's called, Series X. And now we're looking at the Steam Deck with it. So what this does is this does not technically show us heat or show us air in a sense. What it's showing us is the air density gradient change. So we're looking at the, actually you can see it right here because I've got the Steam Deck over there. This is air coming out of the top of the Steam Deck, and we'll do some voiceover in a minute with some analysis. And what you're looking at is light being split. So you can see when I come across this light source, this really tiny point light right here, it all goes black. So what this is doing is projecting a light at that lens, that basically mirror. It's got a really specific curvature on it, projecting off of that, coming back in, and you can see on the blade of the razor right there that it's getting split by the blade. We're basically cutting light in half, looking at a delta in the air density, and it has nothing technically to do with hot or cold, but in this scenario, it allows us to see where the hot air is going because the density is different than the ambient temperature air, which is about probably 19 degrees Celsius in here. So rather than doing thermal imaging, which is basically useless here, we wired up for thermocouples. We take direct measurements as close to the silicon as we can, and then we use Schlieren imaging so that we can observe the air behavior. And here it is. This first shot shows the Steam Deck standing straight and with the exhaust positioned centrally on the lens. You can see a clear pattern where the vent dissects the air and splits it to fan out wide on the exit. The highest velocity air is right in the middle, and it's pretty obvious. There's one stray plume going out to the right. It eventually gets drafted back into the main exhaust, and then there's another plume out to the left. We next lowered the Steam Deck to the bottom of the shot so that we could better see the air patterns and how high they go and see if they change as they go up. At the bottom left and bottom right, you can see the air density gradient shifting from heat passively coming off the back of the device in addition to the exhaust. Overall, the exhaust maintains impressively high velocity as it's propelled from this small fan. Here's a shot of the Steam Deck on its face. We've covered and redirected the exhaust down and out of the shot by using a duct, allowing us to just see the air density change from the heat emanating from the back of the Steam Deck. You can see the density change influenced by heat drafting off the back of the device without influence from the fan. And it's particularly noticeable where the grill with the tin shield is located on the device. So that helps illustrate the external behavior, but it's time to talk about the internal behavior and the thermals. We're going to look at thermals next. We identified most of the components on the board and the ICs, and then determined which would likely be hotspots, and then wired them up for K-type thermocouples. Anything that has a thermal pad contacting it was contacted at the side of the module with the thermocouple instead of on top, so it didn't interfere with anything. And then anything that is relying on airflow was contacted in the top center. We used the same approach that basically everyone uses for their thermocouple testing, and by everyone we mean the manufacturers and the engineers. So this would include Valve, for example. All that said, we have thermal data for several test cases. We'll put all the scenarios we ran on the screen now. These 8 test cases took 2 full days, or nights rather, to complete, and required me to sleep on the office couch for those 2 nights, but we got them all done. Most of these will be in a follow-up thermomechanical analysis video looking at pressure maps of the mounting mechanism and flatness of the cold plate as well, so make sure you're subscribed for that. The main chart, though, is up now. This is the worst case scenario for Valve. It's a torture workload. The Steam Deck is charging from low battery while running a game, which means that the power load is 44 watts at the wall. That's the max the deck is rated for. Our results are somewhat similar to Valve's internal results that it shared with us for validation, but we stray in a few areas. Critically, we observed that memory module 4, which is the bottom right nearest the battery and the VRM, is the hottest module at 77 degrees Celsius with the cover on. Valve also saw this as the hottest module, so we're in alignment there. The memory spec is listed at 85C. We're technically within range, we're below that. It's close enough to maybe be concerning in a higher ambient since the fan will follow the APU's behavior, not the memory. So if the APU is running cool, the memory will potentially run hotter if the fan's not spinning fast enough. This is why you have to be careful if you do a custom backplate or something, because if you cool down the APU, the fan will slow down, which means the memory will get hotter because they're not directly synced. Anyway, that's for another time. As the device ages and gets dusty, this number will creep up closer to spec, but Valve overall is doing okay. Modules 1 and 2 are well within spec and no issue at all, so well done there. Battery 19, that's the charging circuit we measured. That runs very hot. This is also in line with Valve's internal results where it showed that the battery charging IC was the hottest component, or one of them out of those that it measured, although we monitored a slightly higher temperature in our torture workload due to our more aggressive testing methodology. 91 degrees is below the 105C spec for the battery charging circuit, but we'd still call this one potentially concerning. This only gets hot when charging. When running on battery, it's basically local ambient, so often in the 40s to 60s, and it'll only get really beaten up if you're gaming while charging from basically 0. The hotspot MOSFET we measured ran at 74 degrees, which is well within the 105C spec. It has plenty of room to scale with a lower fan RPM, and then GPU and CPU average thermals are both at about 78 to 79 degrees Celsius, which is acceptable for these AMD parts. We draw the concerned line closer to 90 degrees for these AMD components, so that's a lot of room as the device ages. Let's add another line. We removed the back plate and propped the Steam Deck up. It's in the same position, just without any blockage to the airflow at all, including the back plate, and then measured again. This was done after allowing the deck to cool to ambient, and the stainless steel shield, all other components were left in place. The backplate actually helps the design. First off, highlighting battery 19, you'll see why we had to abandon this test early in order to protect the Steam Deck. We hit 100 degrees Celsius rapidly and we were still rising. The backplate is needed to keep this IC within spec, despite the lack of obvious airflow. Next, we'll highlight the SSD temperature, which ran warmer without the backplate. Memory 1 was within variance, but potentially a difference here. The CPU and GPU temperatures both dropped drastically without the backplate, about 15 degrees Celsius. If this were all you were going to test by just spot checking the screen, you'd incorrectly think that the backplate is drastically hurting thermal performance of the Steam Deck. but you'd also roast your charging IC into a day one grave. So let's talk about results then. In using a cooling fan, you have sort of two main options. There's pressure and there's flow. And in a PQ curve, there's a crossover point called the operating point where they could also target. What Valve is trying to do here is operate sort of smarter rather than harder. So they're not brute forcing flow over all the components, and they're also minimizing the contact of conductors like higher quality cold plates and fin stacks on components for two main reasons. One is the form factor of the device, to keep it small. The other is weight of the device. Obviously, the cynical side would also be cost, but the main one is probably form factor. So what Valve is doing is trying to use one very small fan with a very high RPM relatively to draw as much air as it can over all the components on the board without directly cooling them, because it's just not big enough to get direct airflow over everything, and there's not direct heat sinking to everything anyway. The design works pretty well. There are a few ways to improve it, but the main ones are just by tuning the fan hysterics and making the fan RPM ramp less noticeable to the end user. It's not particularly loud, but users notice the oscillation or the change, the hard change from A to B RPM more than anything else. So that we think needs to be tuned. It's not terrible, but it's probably the weakest point in the design. As for how the design works, let's talk about that. This lives and dies mostly on the Bernoulli principle, which we'll go over in a second. If you look at this CFD, this computational fluid dynamics diagram that Valve provided, extremely helpful by the way, what you can see is what we observed in testing, where this is the SoC, these are the VRAM modules, that's the fan, the battery's over here. And what's happening is you have all the exhaust coming out this way, so that's not really relevant here. The fan, because this fan inlet, which if we just orient this the same way, the fan inlet right here does not have any access to air because there's a chassis there. It's completely obstructed. And so that impedance, the lack of accessible flow through the inlet, means that the air is forced to come in everywhere else. This is a negative pressure setup. And so the air will be drawn in through any cracks that are present, as opposed to positive pressure where it's just forced into the chassis. So the primary entry points then are going to be right here, where this is actually just for looks. It's just to black it out to match the back plate. And there's a slight grill here. It looks like there's no intake, but there is a little bit of clearance between the chassis, the grill, and this plate from the shield can, which is a stainless steel. And you can see that here too, where there's more of in the simulation, there's some airflow over in this side of things. The air gets drawn up and across the memory module, so they really need this. Let's take this piece off. So this is how we wired it up. This is actually really similar to how Valve wired it up. So components that aren't directly heat sinked into this stainless shield can, which doesn't have that much thermal conductivity anyway, they end up getting cooled by direct airflow over them, which is why removing the chassis makes things worse. Very simple in that regard. The components that have a thermal pad contacting them, like this IC down here, end up not being able to use any of that heat capacity of the air. They don't get cooled by the air directly. They get cooled indirectly, which is mostly through air flowing over or under this plate, but that's about it. Now, the last piece here too, and we'll show all of this in our teardown video separately, but you can see this magnesium, there's a magnesium subframe, and you also see this sort of squiggly line here. This serves both for rigidity purposes or for structural integrity, but also for heat sinking, and air flows both under and over this board, which is the motherboard, where you've got all the VRM components, everything else that's hot. So that's really just how the cooling design works. Pretty straightforward. We'll add more thermal pads in a separate piece in the future just to see if Valve cut corners where maybe they shouldn't have. Overall, it's working okay. The core idea of all of this is that decreasing the flow in an area will increase the pressure and vice versa. So that's what this is designed around, and that's why opening up the chassis in some areas won't help it, even though it maybe seems counterintuitive. Really interesting design though. Showing the fan RPM helps illustrate the previous points. With the backplate on and in the torture workload, the fan oscillated between 0 and 4100 RPM when idle. This small fan doesn't do much below that, so it does need to spin at that higher speed, but we do think that Valve needs to really steady out this behavior, as the ramp and deramp is noticeable. For the first 2 minutes of gaming, the fan ran at 6,000 RPM, boosting from 4,000 RPM at idle. Now, because it's small, this is expected. The fan eventually ramped one more time to 6,300 RPM and stayed there. This is what allows the battery IC to remain within spec. Abandoning the no backplate test means we have less data, as you'll see here, but you can still see the result. The fan ramped to only 5,000 RPM. It's a level entirely skipped past in the first test, since the APU didn't run at a temperature that matched this lower RPM. So although no backplate makes it quieter and makes the APU cooler, it is obviously untenable for other components. The trouble, though, is that the fan never increased in speed, and even if it did, the resistance wouldn't have existed from the backplate to force the air to be dragged over other ICs on the board. It would just come from outside of the chassis. It's just like a GPU. If you cool the GPU core passively too much, the memory can overheat just by nature of the fan following the GPU temperature and sitting at 0. Okay, so we're moving on to noise tests. A little bit about the methodology here. For testing this device specifically, we want to test it in a way where it's somewhat comparable to our standard methodology, but we're also considering the use case. Most users will probably have it about like this, or maybe they'll be leaned on something. So the distance is fairly fixed. This is very close to our standardized 20-inch measuring distance that we use for other components. It's maybe more like 16 or 18, but we're going with 20 inches measuring distance. That keeps it the same as our other methodology. And ultimately, that's what matters, is consistency in measurement. The next thing that's important is that the exhaust is not pointed at the dB meter, because then you're just collecting wind noise, which is garbage data. And so we positioned this roughly here. We propped it up from the back. This is a 20-inch distance when it's all set up and going. The dB meter is fixed in this location. We're measuring it in our sound booth. This is our temporary holdover. We'll show you as we get one of our smaller isolation chambers in. We have one on the way. We'll be showing shortly, probably this week. So this sound booth has a noise floor of about 25.7 dBA. It's about the same as if you were in a quiet suburban residential area with all AC or HVAC disabled and no one else in the house. That's about the noise of this sound booth. The goal here is to get the noise floor as low as possible, because a quiet device like this with one small fan doesn't make that much noise, and so we need as much headroom as we can over the noise floor in order to see the actual delta in the noise that the user experiences versus just being in the room, period. The one thing I really want to point out here is we see this a lot in videos where people will kind of have a laptop or some device, and then they'll like hold the dB meter and point at it and then film the screen of the dB meter and act like that's useful. It's completely useless data. So first of all, if you don't know the noise floor, then the number on the screen here is pointless, because right now it says 80 because I'm talking. And so if we turn the device on and it's like 0.5 dBA different, it doesn't mean anything to anybody. The next reason it's not useful is handling noise. If you're holding the meter and slightly moving it around, or maybe you drift an inch or two here and there, that changes the numbers a lot. The third reason it's pointless is because you need something comparative. It either has to be compared to another device or it has to be compared to itself. Here's the noise chart. The device sometimes idles without any audible fan spin, but it occasionally oscillates to about 1 to 1.5 dBA above our noise floor. That oscillation you're seeing was confirmed in laser tachometer measurements of the fan and in a conversation with Valve, which noted that the fan speed goes from 0 to 4100 RPM while idle. The next section of the graph is when we launched Devil May Cry 5, which got stuck and glitched out in a perpetual loading loop. This happens sometimes in current development software. It's a lot of fun to work with, but should be fixed by the launch. The hard dip just before 1000 seconds is when we restarted the system, which resolves that bug. All device input and human interaction noise in this time was filtered out of the data you're seeing. Now working properly, the DMC menu screen idled at about 31.7 dBA, then ramped to about 36 dBA during gameplay, and obviously there's no audio from the device during this. It remained at this level constantly. We left one operator spike visible at 2460 seconds, where you can see the spike to 38 dBA. That's us plugging in the power cable. It stays there at this point and sits at roughly 37, 38 dBA, and so the system is now at max power draw under the most torturous of workloads it can be under, which is charging while gaming. So up next, battery testing is one of the most important aspects of a mobile device like the Steam Deck, so we spent a few days working on this one. The battery included in this, it's right here, it's a 40 watt-hour battery. Valve claims that this can support 2 to 8 hours of gameplay. Now, you don't have to be much of a numbers person to know that the range of 2 to 8 is exceptionally wide, but to be fair to Valve, gameplay just in general is also a very wide concept. Depends on the type of game you're playing. So, for expectation management, and to make sure everyone's on the same page, the games that Valve claims can do 8 hours of battery life on this are Portal 2, which is 11 years old at 30 FPS capped, or Dead Cells, which you can just look at it, at 60 FPS capped. So for this, we did testing with a lot of controls in place. We had the screen set to a static 50% brightness. Obviously, the brighter it is, the more battery it will drain. There's one point where we have a major methodological differing of opinions with Valve. Valve did its testing without any input at all. We tested with active input for the entirety of the test. Now, because we're not going to have anyone sit here and run in a circle in DMC5 for 6 hours or whatever, we invented a proprietary piece of automation technology. We haven't filed the patent on this yet, so hopefully no one steals it. We had active input for the entirety of our test. This means our testing is simulating you actually using the device to see how long it would live if you were actually using it. DMC5 with 60 FPS VSync and high settings didn't fully load the CPU or the GPU, so the battery life was about 2 hours here. With DMC5 uncapped for FPS and on higher settings without VSync, it lived only 87 minutes. Not bad overall, but obviously far less. This just shows that 2 hours isn't a minimum, despite Valve's 2 hour range at the lower end. That 2 hour range assumes lower, more reasonable graphics settings like VSync, FPS caps, and disabled RT effects. Dead Cells with VSync tested the upper bound, resulting in a total battery life of 6 hours. More than this is very unlikely in most games unless tested with extremely low settings. We couldn't replicate Valve's results, but we also tested with input, and they didn't. We had some differences in methodology. Streaming a remote 1280 by 800 session from an in-network PC with default Steam streaming quality settings also resulted in a battery life of almost exactly 6 hours. The game is rendered on a host PC, and all the deck has to do is display the output. It's not actually rendering the game. This is one of the strongest use cases for a mobile device like the deck, but it's also the least unique feature. This has been available through the Steam Link app on mobile devices for a long time now. You don't need a deck for this. We also installed VLC and we played a looping 4K video locally until it died. With that workload, the system lasted about 3 hours. This was the only battery test we performed in desktop mode as well. Talking about the charge time and charging behavior, the AC adapter provided with the Steam Deck is rated for 45 watts output. We logged power consumption continuously at the wall while charging, and we observed the behavior in this chart. Blender render workloads while the battery was below 100% charge, so while it's charging, showed a constant draw of 44 watts without any hubs or peripherals connected. That's shown best in this truncated version of our chart. Plugging in a higher wattage USB-C adapter, so 60 watts, 20 volts at 3 amps, from the Ioneo still resulted in a capped power draw of approximately 45 watts. Routing power through a third-party USB-C hub affected our power numbers unpredictably as well when we were measuring, and so all power testing was therefore done with a direct connection to the device. With the system on and idle with the screen at 50% brightness, the deck took almost exactly 3 hours to charge every single time we tested it, multiple passes over multiple days. Recording system power draw during the recharging process reveals a slow rise from 31 watts to a peak of 33 watts after 100 minutes. Part of this is power leakage from heat of the components internally, where you start losing efficiency, but 2 extra watts isn't bad. It falls off at this point, and internally, the system reported a constant 20-watt charging rate during this period. The peak coincides with the battery hitting 80% charge exactly every single time. After the battery hits 80%, the charging rate slowly drops to about 9 watts, which drops to 6 watts when charging completes. In other words, the deck can be fast charged to 80% in 100 minutes while on, but a proper charge takes 3 hours while on and idle. And that's intentional. That's a battery preservation technique. Lithium ion has a limited amount of charge cycles before it basically dies or becomes less useful, and running it from 0 to 100% at full charging speed, full current, and full heat will diminish the life of the battery. So what Valve's doing here is the correct thing to do. APU power for the custom Zen 2 APU is claimed to be 4 to 15 watts by Valve and AMD. But as we know from long experience, numbers like AMD TDP don't really tell us anything of value. PPT, as reported through software, was 15.3 to 15.4 watts on average during a Blender workload. That's regardless of whether the system was connected to wall power. It had spikes up to 18 watts. We logged additional spikes to 19 watts in other scenarios that involved the GPU load. With the system fully charged so that no power was being diverted to the battery, total system power draw was 27.7 watts average during the Blender test and 30 watts in the DMC5 test area with our custom higher settings profile and VSync disabled. We weren't able to create a scenario where the fully charged deck drew more power than the AC adapter could deliver. But as mentioned earlier, loading the system while simultaneously charging the battery reached the power delivery limit of the AC adapter at 45 watts. So in other words, the deck will still charge if it's plugged in and playing a game, just slower than it would otherwise. Up next is gaming performance. So for this, because the Steam Deck uses a customized version of Arch Linux, we were unable to use our standardized hardware logging and monitoring utilities that we trust and use for everything else, like you see here. But we were able to use some built-in Linux utilities, so we retooled to use those. We also had to rely on Valve's currently in development performance overlay and logger for the Steam Deck. This unfortunately means that we have to put a lot of trust into Valve's utility, and without much validation out there, it's hard to speak on how accurate it is. The numbers it spits out include average FPS, a 97% number, a 1% and a 0.1%. Couple caveats here. One of them is that the summary is not something we use because the summary is an average of averages. So instead of taking just the frame time data and working from that, Valve has taken an average of the average frame rate, which we're assuming is over a 1 second period, but it's not quite clear. And then it's averaging that. And so we didn't use it. But you can still use the raw frame time data, which is what we do for our normal benchmarking anyway. For the 1%, 0.1% numbers, Valve calculates those differently than we do. Won't go into the detail on that today. We prefer our method, so we recalculated the 1% and 0.1% numbers to match our standardized testing suite that's been validated on literally hundreds of components and tens of thousands of test passes over the last however many years. These aren't the only issues we encountered with doing game testing on Valve's Steam Deck, but we wanted to mention them as an example of the extra care and precautions we had to take with testing this device to make sure the data is accurate and representative of an actual user experience, because this particular launch, Valve was coming in hot. We were also allowed to benchmark this small selection of games as part of this hardware review piece. These are games handpicked by Valve, so we're not going to do any comparative testing with other devices because there's not much point until the decks are released, ready, and we can choose our own software as a third party. Control launched into DX11 without a DX12 option, meaning no ray tracing features were available at all. Running on wall power, the medium preset was the highest we could go without sacrificing playability. This preset resulted in 36 FPS average with 0.1% lows down to 31 FPS in our chosen test area, which is right on the border of what we'd consider playable. It's not just a matter of frame rate, but also of input latency, shown later in this review. Some experimentation with combat showed us that this medium preset keeps the game responsive enough to aim and fight, but for a full playthrough, we would tune the lighting and the shadows down further. Using battery power, all numbers were within variance of the wall power results, 37 FPS average. There was no measurable boost provided from simply plugging it in. There might be other benefits, but they're not here. Ghostrunner allowed us an opportunity to try out ray tracing with the Steam Deck's ray tracing hardware. Maxing out the settings on wall power with RT enabled resulted in a 40 FPS average with a 34 FPS 0.1% low. It's not the best experience for a fast-paced game, and that's even without entering combat. Still, it's impressive to see the Steam Deck running a maxed out title with RT on and maintaining a frame rate that's technically playable. Running on battery had no significant effect on performance, so from here on we'll just talk about the battery-powered results since they're more likely to be used. Using the more modest high settings with Ghostrunner and disabling RT brought the average to 64 FPS, a 49 FPS 0.1% low, and overall an easier time navigating jumps without overcompensating. This is more the territory you'd want to be in for Ghostrunner, so high settings are doable thanks to the relatively low resolution, but RT is too aggressive, or bordering it. FSR or super resolution might help make this work better once fully enabled. Given our other test results, we were confident enough to try Forza Horizon 5 with the high preset, but it wasn't up to par. 39 FPS average with a 25 FPS 0.1% low might be doable in some games, but in Forza, it makes the steering unplayably sluggish. Bumping the game down to the low preset put us at a much more reasonable 61 FPS average, with lows of 32 FPS that don't affect gameplay. In the future, lowering the render resolution and compensating with features like FSR would allow for higher settings. We've done some testing with DMC5 in the past and found that it's very easy to get high frame rates. It's probably part of the reason why it was one of the earliest games to receive a greater than 60 FPS mode update on current gen consoles. The chart here shows the frame time plot rather than FPS, but FPS is just derived from frame time anyway. Each point on the plot is 1 frame, so this is the truest representation of the experience. So we're seeing the time in milliseconds required to present the frame to the player each frame. Excursions from frame n-1 greater than 8 to 12 milliseconds are undesirable and become visible as slight hitches. On the deck, we found that we could max out every setting at 1280 by 800 in our test area without any problems. There aren't any graphics presets in DMC5, but we'll call this Ultra for convenience. At Ultra, DMC maintained a 62 FPS average with a 0.1% low of 52, averaged across 4 passes like all the other games. The frame time plot only shows 3 slight deviations from the mean, and none of them are big enough spikes to be noticed here. Frame time consistency looks extremely good here. We're going to do latency testing as well really quick, but we want to be careful about laying the groundwork before we get into the numbers. First of all, latency numbers, as we've shown in previous research pieces, are entirely situational and based on things like FPS. And secondly, they don't mean much without a point of comparison. Since the Steam Deck is essentially a PC and allows full control over graphics settings, that makes it difficult to assign a single latency number to the system or to individual games the way we could with Stadia. If the latency is high, lowering the settings will make it better. You control the latency. It's a PC. So to say the device has some latency means actually nothing, because that's not how it works. We wanted to make that clear because we had a lot of requests for latency testing on the Steam Deck, and it shows up a bit in streaming from a PC to the deck, and that's valid, or at least more valid. But for just localized testing, it'd be the same as testing input latency on your computer. You're looking at basically device input, which is single-digit milliseconds most of the time. Therefore, the most useful thing we can do with these numbers is to use them for comparison between individual components or whole systems, rather than trying to say latency is good or latency is bad. And that's where the streaming test comes in and the INEO comes in. First, with control at minimum settings and 1280 by 800 with VSync disabled, the baseline latency for control running on the Steam Deck was 108 milliseconds click to photon response while running at 87 FPS average. This isn't a performance benchmark, but a reminder that FPS influences the result. Our 360Hz external display was locked to 60Hz due to the Steam Deck's software limitations, so we didn't see any benefit from using it here. Streaming with auto settings over 5 GHz wireless LAN from a PC with a hardwired 10 gigabit per second network connection averaged latency at 139 milliseconds for control. Ideally, we would do a network latency test by streaming from one Steam Deck to another, but streaming from a deck wasn't 100% working in time for us to test it. The INEO runs Windows 10 rather than SteamOS, among other differing factors. On battery power, the Neo averaged 149 milliseconds of latency, but it's at 50 FPS average in control, and that's with the same settings. So this starts to look more like a performance comparison between the two than anything else. Just briefly, in Dead Cells, we got these results. The game ran at a much higher FPS, often in the hundreds of frames per second, and that's because of its simplistic nature. As such, the response is better. That's no surprise, and it reinforces our earlier comments about latency being pointless if shown in a vacuum, since it's just a frame rate test at that point. The interesting part here, though, is that the INEO managed to outperform the Steam Deck with localized battery-powered testing. The most likely contributing factors are that the software platforms are entirely different, and that Dead Cells is perhaps too light of a workload to create an obvious hardware bottleneck. In a heavier workload, like Control, the deck's higher-end hardware has the advantage, and this is also where latencies might become large enough to be noticeable. Streaming was about the same as in Control in this game, so we're bound by other factors like the network here. Then as for the display, we got sort of anomalous results for this one, and we're waiting on Valve to finalize its platform before we commit further to evaluating this aspect. So for anyone jumping here, we've timestamped the video as best we can. We can't possibly boil it all back down into a conclusion again, because there were conclusions for each section. The quick version of this. So for battery testing, the main takeaway is that you want VSync and cap frame rates while on battery. Otherwise, you're not going to get anywhere close to the numbers that Valve has published in its specs tables. We think this is reasonable. It makes sense. You have to trade off somewhere for a battery-operated device. But we were not able to reach the 8-hour mark at the high end of what Valve was showing. We also had different opinions on methodology, though. That was discussed earlier. For thermals, we think the thermal design is impressive and was executed extremely well for how small a device is. We had several doubts entering the testing of this. There are absolutely ways to improve the thermal design without even necessarily expanding the chassis, and we might look at those in separate pieces in the future. But for what Valve has done here, we didn't see anything that was grossly overheating unless you took the backplate off. indicating that it's actually an important part of the design. And overall, our only big concern or complaint with it would have been the battery charging IC. It's okay for the most part though, and acoustics and tuning on the fan hysteresis, it needs a little bit of work there, but Valve is already on that for future updates. We'll talk about the subjective side of things later. The software would love to talk about, but can't right now. It's okay, it's not really ready anyway. And as for the question of is the device worth it, we're not answering that today because we are not able to give you a full picture today because of the software, which is probably the most critical aspect of this. So, all of that stated, the hardware design is very interesting. It's executed fairly well thermally, and now it's down to Valve to execute well on the software, at which point we'll be able to give you a firm conclusion on does it make sense to buy and at what price points. So that's it for this one. This was several weeks in the making. If you want to support this type of work, go to store.gamersnexus.net and back order the coasters. They sold through so fast last time that a lot of you were emailing us for weeks about how you missed out on it. Now's your chance to get it. We have a lot of them coming back in and they're not too far away. So you can go to store.gamersnexus.net to grab one of those and help us out at the same time. Subscribe for more. We have a lot more coming. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.